Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Ann Sheehan. I'm the program coordinator for the Wyomissing Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this very special program with the League of Women Voters of Berks County about the questions that are on the ballot for the primary election next Tuesday. I am happy to introduce Judith Cranis, who is a longtime member of the League, and she will take care of the rest of the program. Thank you,
Thank
Judith.
you, Ann. And good evening and welcome. I will note that last fall was a big election. This one is bigger yet. We're voting for judges at the state, county, and local level, for school boards, borough, township, and city officials, and for auditors, tax collectors, and constables. But giving this election even greater importance, we are voting on 3 potential changes, amendments to our Pennsylvania Constitution, as well as a referendum on fire station loans. And those 4 ballot questions are what we're going to be talking about tonight. My guests are municipal legal expert Joan London, who is representing the Berks County Bar Association, and Dr. Randall Noonan, a professor of political science at Penn State Berks. Now, all of us represent nonpartisan organizations, and our goal is to familiarize you with all the nuances around these 4 questions. It's up to you to decide how you will vote. Now, we're going to start with the ballot questions number 1 and number 2. They are related, and they change constitutional powers regarding emergency declarations. And after we've discussed these 2 potential amendments to our Constitution, we will open up for questions while that is fresh in your mind. And then we'll discuss the other 2 issues on the ballot and take questions again at the end of the program. So Joan, let me start with you. What exactly is an emergency declaration? Who may issue one? Things like that. Just start us off.
Sure. An emergency declaration is under the Emergency Services Law, which is in Chapter 73 of the Commonwealth Pennsylvania, or Chapter 73 of Title 35 of the Pennsylvania Consolidated Statutes. The governor is the one who would issue these emergency proclamations. Now, quote Section 7301B, which says that the governor may issue, amend, and rescind executive orders, proclamations, and regulations, which shall have the force and effect of law. And this includes, under that same section of the statute, paragraph C, and this is what is at issue in the 2 ballot questions on the proposed constitutional amendments on May 18th. There are 2 parts of this section that are important. The first part is that the governor declares a disaster emergency by executive order or proclamation upon finding that a disaster has occurred or is imminent. And the second, that the state of disaster emergency continues until the governor finds that the threat or danger has passed or the disaster has been dealt with to the extent that emergency conditions no longer exist, and the governor can then terminate the order. The state of disaster emergency is for up to 90 days unless renewed by the governor, and the proposed amendment deals with that issue. And this section also gives the General Assembly power to end the disaster declaration by concurrent resolution. But as you'll see later in this program, what is up for discussion is whether that concurrent resolution on emergency declaration is up for veto. Now, to answer your other question as to what a disaster emergency is, when one thinks of a natural disaster, such as the winter storms of last December and this February, or some catastrophes that have occurred in our lifetime, such as the blizzards and floods and ice storms in January of 1996, which occurred in quick sequence and lasted for several weeks, or the flooding statewide in the early 1970s with Tropical Storm Agnes. And we look in terms of a limited declaration for a limited period of time. To give you an example, in mid-December, there was a severe winter storm. I forget what its name was, but it hit most of the state. Many areas received 2 feet of snow. There was extensive property damage, plus need for snow removal. Governor declared a state of emergency, which suspended some competitive bidding and procurement requirements, freed up resources to respond, open the roads, and repair damage, and allow for eligibility for state and federal relief. Could have been in effect for up to 90 days, which would have placed the state under emergency declaration into March for the storm. By mid-February, the damage had been repaired and the time had elapsed for making application to Pennsylvania Emergency Management, Federal Emergency Management Agency. And the governor terminated the emergency declaration in advance of the 90 days. But there are other types of disaster emergencies as well that have been declared. Think of in January of 2018, the governor declared the opioid situation to be a disaster.
27 people.
And it was renewed for the 13th time on February 9th, 2021. The emergency declaration for COVID-19 was first made March 6, 2020, when the first cases were appearing in Pennsylvania. And on February 19th, it's still in place and will expire next Wednesday unless extended. So there's a whole there are many different types of events which can be considered as a disaster emergency for which governors have invoked emergency powers.
Thank you. I was going to ask is this only done on the state level, or is this something a city council could call, or my township commissioner or something like that?
Yes, there is an ability of a local government under section 75, under chapter 75 of the emergency management law, to declare a disaster. That is a far narrower power, and there has to be an imminent threat to life or safety or property damage.
Mm-hmm.
And the powers, though, are more limited of the local government. It's more of the ability to suspend the sunshine law to allow an emergency meeting to respond to the disaster,
Mm-hmm.
Or to suspend competitive bidding. Usually there are strict competitive bidding requirements for municipal procurement, but municipality in a declared emergency for that short period of time, and only as necessary to respond, would be able to suspend competitive bidding to respond to the declared disaster emergency.
So it's something we could see on a more local level, but this is on the state level.
This is on
let's go to look at the law while what you've said is still in front of people's mind. Randy, could you pull up that first?
Sure. So you want to look at the first referendum question on emergency declaration, right?
Yeah, so everybody can read the actual language.
Okay. Let me scroll down a little here. There we go.
So just tell us basically what it says, and we're going to get into some of the issues in what it says in a few minutes.
Well, basically, the first question is asking about the ability to stop a declaration, an emergency declaration. And the question is, how do you stop an emergency declaration? And as Joan said, currently the law does allow the legislature to stop an emergency declaration by voting. But the problem is that the governor has been able to veto that vote, thus keeping the emergency declaration going. And this ballot question simply, the Republicans would say, clarifies that right by making it clear that the legislature can simply, with a simple majority, just vote to get rid of an emergency declaration. That's what they wanted this ballot question to say.
Let's go on and look at the second one then.
Okay. Now, of course, later on, we can talk about the exact wording of it, which got to be kind of controversial. But that's the basic content of that one. So that's the first one. And then the second one, also related to emergency declarations. The key thing here is that what they're doing is saying that any emergency declaration will expire automatically in only 21 days unless the General Assembly votes to extend it. So, that would mean basically that, you cannot have any emergency declaration longer than 21 days unless the General Assembly meets to confirm that emergency declaration will continue. So taking those two together, it does curtail the governor's power to have emergency declarations, because they can be ended at any time by a simple vote of the legislature, and they will end automatically in 21 days unless the legislature votes to extend. So that's the two emergency declaration related amendments that are on the ballot.
I'm going to add just a couple comments here. Let's take that off the screen so we can
Okay.
see faces again. Does anybody need it up for longer? We can keep it up for longer if you would like it. We're good? Okay. I remember when I was on a government study commission reading about Galveston, Texas, had a big flood. They had a city council, and some business leaders thought the city council wasn't moving fast enough to mattify the flood damage. They weren't doing enough. So they named a commission of 5 people to go ahead and start fixing things, which took over the city council's power. And that government that they formed, a commission form, was a new form. And it was the concept that each commissioner took care of a specific area. And basically that's the government we have here in Berks County. Each commissioner takes care of certain departments of the government, and it's a very efficient way to operate, but it doesn't have the same degree of deliberation that a city council, which is more of a legislative body, would have. And so in my mind, what you want in an emergency is usually fast action, definitive action. You don't need to do a lot of deliberating. You need to deal with it. And that's the background that I would be coming from. So let me ask both Joan and Randy how these two ballot questions relate to my thought process and what one needs in an emergency.
Well, let me start with this as far as what one needs in an emergency. Usually when you're dealing with an emergency like a flood, or as Galveston experienced, or a natural disaster, or even most man-made disasters such as 3 Mile Island, or the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the impact they had on Somerset County. You're dealing with a very limited amount of time, and the statutes provide for that. The statutes, you were talking about local government, for example, the statutes provide for the ability to suspend competitive bidding and suspend the Sunshine Act. And the current state of the law gives very broad and sweeping powers to the executive for the duration of an emergency. But they are very broad and sweeping powers that a governor has. And those powers in one person for a long and indefinite period of time, that would create a certain amount of cynicism in some. Emergencies do require quick response and executive action, but the question is, for how long? For how long is the immediate emergency, the immediate danger to life and property? And then when does the legislative, the body elected by the people to deliberate the best course of action, take over? When there's a fire, you have to put out the fire and you have to board up the building. But then you have a luxury of time as to how to rebuild the house. And I view it the same way. There's a point when there's a luxury of time, and then there has to be a cutoff in time when the elected body takes over. And that would be the view of those who would favor those amendments. And Randall, what is your response to that?
Well, I guess the question would be whether an emergency necessarily is that time limited. And obviously, we're living through one right now, which has been going for a year. And I think the question is the house ready to be rebuilt yet? That's one question. But I guess the question is, in terms of these amendments, do they potentially prevent that kind of quick executive action? Because if the governor's role can be terminated at any time by a simple vote of the legislature, that would mean, in theory, the governor could declare an emergency and the next day the legislature could just override it. And then you really don't have much emergency power at all. So that would definitely seem to tilt it in favor of the legislature. And of course, the legislature often has trouble deciding things in a rapid manner when you have several hundred people debating. And I think that would probably be the governor's argument that that these proposed amendments will shift things back to legislative control, which would mean a lot of local legislators making the decision rather than the governor. So I guess that's the question.
I would even question that, because I think sometimes our local legislators aren't part of making the decision. It's decided by the party in power and presented, and they vote with. That a lot has changed since we had our last constitution as far as the balance between party control and individual responsibility of our legislators.
But I think one thing that has to be taken into account is that that balances can change. And I think that we need to maybe turn down the temperature, take the words Governor Wolf and COVID-19 out of this, because they have become quite politically charged, and think of a possible scenario where it is another governor, another party in power in the executive, another party in power in the legislature, and power and an incredible amount of concentrated power for an indefinite period of time. I mean, some of the powers in the emergency services statute, the governor is commander-in-chief of the state military. The governor can redirect resources, give arrest powers to law enforcement who don't normally serve in an area, redirect resources, limit movement. We have seen the business shutdowns and restrictions. All of these things, I agree. Limit the sale of alcohol, limit the sale of firearms, explosives. All of those things can be limited by the governor, one person, and one has to consider balances of power when considering these amendments. And again, take our current governor and our current disaster and fill in something else in another scenario as you're considering these, in addition to Governor Wolf and COVID.
I agree. That does take the heat down, and it gives us a whole lot of other what ifs. And I know the nature of emergencies is changing. We saw just the other day a pipeline that had ransomware put on it and no delivery of gasoline up its channel till it could be solved. So we're dealing with more climate disasters. We have more severe weather. We'll have more of that, which is the kind of we're used to. But what if we had some massive electronic shutdown? That would be one that wouldn't be so easy to solve in a few number of days. That would be a very difficult one. So we have to think of all those things, I think, that could happen future-wise as we debate it. There were, you had mentioned, Randy, some issues with the wording of this. Do you want to go into that? That was an interesting thing. And I must say, I was interested to learn that the actual language of the ballot question is not in the legislation passed by the legislature. It is written by the Secretary of State. The plain language version, which you all would have gotten if you got a mail-in ballot, it came with, it was in the newspaper, that is written by the Attorney General. So we have several different people in the executive, or two branches of the executive function, weighing in on the language. So tell us what That was all about it.
Well, the state legislature is not happy with either one of those two executive officials because, of course, the attorney general, who is elected separately, as you probably know, the attorney general is not a member of the Wolf administration, but also is a Democrat. Incidentally, a Democrat who many people think might be running for governor next time. So he has his own probably political priorities. And the Secretary of State is a member of the Wolf administration. So the legislature believes that the exact wording of both that plain language version and the actual ballot question that you'll be seeing on your ballot, that both of those were worded in such a way to try to make the amendment fail, or both amendments fail. So if you look, maybe I'll put back up for a moment the language. Let's see. You can see that if we look at this as the second one now, you look at the first one, there's a couple of things in here that I think the people who passed the amendment to begin with were not really happy with. For example, the fact that it says increase the power of the General Assembly. That was something that they were not happy with because, of course, as Joan said, the whole talking point on their side for why we need to pass these things is to have a better balance of power, they believe, between the governor and the legislature. But this is written so that it stresses the fact that it will increase the power of the General Assembly and that they will have the right now to unilaterally terminate or extend a disaster emergency. So making it look like the General Assembly will now basically be the dictators. And also that the wording would stress, regardless of the severity of that emergency. So, of course, saying that, you know, even if the state is about to explode from a nuclear reactor, the General Assembly can still get rid of the emergency declaration. That's intended to make people think twice about this resolution. And then finally, the fact that it says that letting the legislature make the decision removes an existing check and balance of presenting the resolution to the governor for approval or disapproval. That also makes it sound like what the legislature is proposing is quite a radical change and hurts the balance of power between the governor and the legislature. So all of those wordings in the amendment, and I think the second one was similar, all of those were things that the Republican-led legislature was very unhappy with. And they felt that this was basically being set up by the Secretary of State to fail, was the idea. And so they would much rather have been able to do the wording themselves, I think, and they would have put it a little differently.
Yeah, I mean, the wording ballot questions is supposed to be objective wording, and I'll let the viewers decide for themselves whether or not this language is loaded or not.
I have another question, and it's one of the things that has bothered me and that is the simple majority. That suggests a partisan split. I wonder if they had suggested a 2/3 majority, how would that change the nature of the balance of the checks and balances in government? How would that have been different?
It might have been different because for example, to override a veto, there must be a 2/3 majority. And when it's on a concurrent resolution, which is what this addresses, overriding a governor's veto would require a 2/3 majority, which in this case, the state legislature was unable to get, because in the history of what happened in this case, these constitutional amendments as proposed are intended to clarify and to overrule and supersede the Scarnati versus Wolf decision that was decided on June 1st, after the state legislature under Section 7301 passed a concurrent resolution. Now, what's interesting is in the language of section 7301C of the Emergency Services Law, it allows the emergency to be ended by concurrent resolution. And it says that upon concurrent resolution, the governor shall end the declaration or proclamation of disaster. However, the court looked at the state constitution and determined that the only case that wasn't subject to the governor's veto was to adjourn or the house of the state legislature. And in that case, and this was not such a case, then the court found in a 5-2 decision, which was a partisan split decision, that the governor was entitled to veto the concurrent resolution, that it was subject to veto, and the state legislature could not achieve the 2/3 majority to override the veto.
Randy,
yes,
your thoughts on how it might make it more partisan?
Well, it's true. I think if it were a 2/3 majority that was required, then that would bring it more into the question of legislature versus governor. Because I think the Republican legislature is trying to argue that what they're trying to do is do an institutional balance between the legislature and the governor. But if they've only got a simple majority, then that does just look like a partisan majority as opposed to standing up for the institution. But yeah, that's, I'm sure, would be quite debated. All of these things are debated. That's the fun about politics.
Well, yeah,
if it
are
were
there
easy,
any
it
final
wouldn't be
comments
fun.
you have, either of you, before we go to questions?
Oh, questions on the emergency declarations part. Yeah, we probably
Yeah,
can get to that.
let's open up. Anne, if you will
If you were-
monitor see who has questions, and let's hear the questions or comments. This group is,
Okay,
we like civil discourse.
does
I'm not
anybody
making
have any questions? Does anybody have any questions? Oh, I have to unmute everybody, I guess.
Well, are they allowed to unmute themselves? Because
Yeah, you can, yeah, actually, if you have a question and you unmute yourself, that's how we will know. Thank you, Randy.
I think they could potentially put it in chat also.
Yeah.
Right, I'm looking at chat. I'm not seeing anything there in chat, but yeah, we can certainly proceed informally and ask any questions.
Are there any?
Well, I have one.
Okay,
Okay.
I have one too.
All right. So, yeah, what if they had written it as a 2/3 rather than a simple majority? Would the panel share their feelings about that? How that would change the game?
Can I, is that, what's this, wave? No, it's clap.
Say you want to say something.
But Randy or Joan, how in your mind would being a 2/3 majority have changed how you would look at this amendment?
Or you could put it in the chat.
Well, as I said, it might make it look more like it was not a partisan exercise and it was more a question of the legislature versus the governor, but it also would have really negated the practical effect of it quite a bit, because as Joan had said, if they had 2/3, they could have just overridden the governor's veto and the whole thing would have been decided anyway. So, and they did not. So in terms of the practical question of, obviously the elephant in the room here, so to speak, is can the legislature terminate the governor's COVID-19 emergency declaration, which is kind of the objective here. And if they had written it as 2/3, that would not have helped them to do that, because they couldn't get the 2/3 anyway.
Okay.
I agree. It would not have changed. It would not have changed. It certainly would have changed perception, but in this case, it would not have changed reality. Now, maybe in a future maybe in a future crisis, maybe that would be different, but certainly had it been written differently, it would have had a less partisan tone, but zero practical effect in this and most cases.
Okay.
Are there other questions?
Mary Jo?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Mary Jo.
I had to leave the discussion for a few minutes, and maybe this question was asked. Are there any other types of resolutions that do not have to go before the governor for his signature or his veto?
That would be the resolution to, I believe, adjourn the State House of Representatives or the Senate. That specifically in the Constitution does not have does not have to go to the governor and is not subject to the governor's veto. And the Supreme Court, even with the word shall in 7301C, shall end the disaster emergency upon concurrent resolution, felt that the wording in the state constitution overrode the wording of the statute, I believe, and found that that it was subject to the governor's veto. But that is the only one I believe that's specifically not subject to the governor's veto. But any resolution that goes to the governor for veto and any legislation that is vetoed by the governor is subject to override. Randy?
I see we have a question that came in the chat from, I think, from the Bromleys, asking whether there is a practical effect on the ability to borrow if this emergency declaration is suspended or if this change goes through. I think that's one of the arguments the governor has made, perhaps. You want to comment on that?
That's correct,
Joan?
Randy. You read it correctly.
Yeah, I mean, the only borrowing that would impact is if that borrowing was dependent on
Richard, there.
a state of disaster.
I sent him
But I
a
know from
link.
my experience with municipalities and applications for disaster aid from FEMA and PEMA, that it tends to be contingent on a disaster emergency having been declared, and the time is held open, and there's a deadline after the termination of the emergency for applications for aid. I don't think it would really affect this time, because at this point, we're and I hope I'm right, we appear to be at the end of the crisis. The numbers are going down, the vaccinations are out, and the restrictions are in the process of being lifted. They're going to be lifted statewide as of May 31st. Philadelphia will shortly be lifting its restrictions. Mayor Kenny made an announcement today. So the likelihood of needing further assistance based on this crisis is all but over. But as far
Wow,
as,
that's awfully optimistic, Joan. I hope you're right on that.
I hope I'm right. I hope I'm right too. I mean, there are some tragic situations in other countries, unfortunately, and hopefully we are well protected against those.
Well, my understanding is
Two
that
follow-ups.
there's an awful lot of other aid that we're getting from Washington that's contingent on this emergency other than FEMA. I think there's a lot of the emergency spending that's been passed by Congress that I'm not sure, might be contingent on that emergency declaration. At least that's the governor's argument anyway, is that a lot of the money we're getting from Washington on an ongoing basis for this crisis would be including things like extra unemployment benefits and so on, might be in jeopardy if the emergency declaration disappears. But
Well,
anyway, yeah.
In many states, though, they have ended their emergency declaration. And, I would assume that they are also will be getting some form of federal aid. But again, what I've noticed with disaster emergencies with municipalities is that there is a discrete time period of the disaster, and then there's a time period afterwards for filing based on losses.
I think Richard wants to get in again.
Yeah,
Yes.
two aspects of follow-up, and now I've forgotten them. One, there's the question, the complementary aspect of the ability to borrow is the enticement of people to engage in submitting a bid to do the work. And if there's a concern that the emergency support might not continue to a sufficient amount of time, then in turn, someone may not want to bid on the job at all. Secondly, I agree with Randy. I believe there are, in fact, necessities for the locality, whether municipal or state, to have declared an emergency in order for federal funding to be fully available.
That is correct, that in order for federal funding to be fully available, there has to be a declaration. The question is for how long that has to continue for the federal funding to be available. And I think that may be dependent on the particulars of each type of disaster, natural or man-made disaster.
And you just reminded me of the other aspect that I was going to mention. That is, I think that in your most recent answer, you were starting to fall back into the concept of today's emergency rather than a generic emergency, for which the ending time might not be quite so clear. Thank you.
I think we should go on to talk about our other two questions. And I know Joan has a municipal meeting tonight at 7. So we're going to shift our order and talk about the loan for firefighters and ambulances and things like that. So let me just shift to that background. And I do want to remind you that though this is a primary election where people vote for the candidates in their party that they want to vote for in November, everybody votes on ballot questions. And you can be an independent, you can be a green, a libertarian, any other party, or have no party. And you as a registered voter are needed to vote on these questions. So if you know anybody who says, oh, I never vote in the primary, please talk them into voting. It's critical. I think one of the reasons constitutional amendments and things come up in a primary election rather than a general is both parties know there will be fewer voters at the polls. And the voters at the polls are the ones most loyal to their party because they want to have that voice in choosing the party's candidates. So a good way to keep all everybody else out of the picture and only have your faithful vote is to have it in the primary election. And that is what it's so important we not allow to happen. Everybody needs to vote. So make sure all your friends, people you talk to in the grocery store, wherever, know that this one, it's important for them to come and vote. So let's
judicial campaigns where I've been told that only 17% vote in primaries on average. It's really an embarrassingly low number. We'd be having numbers more like last November.
Yeah, that would be cool if we could have those numbers from November every single election. It would be, and it is. It's a right that we have. It's also a responsibility. Now we're going to go to the fourth ballot question, which is not a constitutional amendment. It's a referendum. And I should note as background that in past years, voters approved up to $100 million of state indebtedness to support a fund to provide loans to volunteer fire departments. And we have in that fund currently $47 million. And this money may be borrowed to establish or modernize facilities for housing vehicles and the equipment, to purchase firefighting equipment, apparatus, communications equipment, ambulances, rescue vehicles, and other necessary equipment. So let's look at the ballot question. Randy, would you put that up for us?
Okay, coming right up. Now, again, this has some rather long wording, but the key part of this is that it is authorizing, including that this loan fund should be used not only for volunteer fire companies, which is how it was originally set up, but that it will now be able to be used for loans to municipal fire departments or companies that provide service through paid personnel. That's the key difference. When this was originally set up, it was originally intended only for volunteer fire companies to benefit from the fund. Oh, and in case you're wondering, by the way, when I saw this this ballot question, my first thought was, why does this have to go on the statewide ballot? Because it seemed to me to be a pretty small question. This one fund, who is eligible to use this one fund? But the fact is that the fund was originally created by a referendum question. So therefore, changes to the fund, as I understand it, have to go through the referendum process as well. So that's why, otherwise you would think the legislature could have easily taken care of this one with a small bill, but that's not the case. So they're planning to extend these loans from just volunteer fire companies to regular municipal or paid fire companies. That's the intent. And Joan can probably talk a little bit about why they felt that was an important thing to do.
And Joan is municipal solicitor for several townships and boroughs that have fire departments, so she has a good deal of expertise and understanding here. So Joan, tell us more.
And it's funny, I am sitting at a meeting table in the meeting room at Upper Tulpehocken Township, because once I leave this broadcast and this meeting, I have to go over to the garage where we're having our township supervisors meeting. And I spend a lot of nights at these meeting tables. Luckily, the manager, Sue Eretz, was nice enough to let me use the meeting room tonight. But anyway, the reason I believe for this expansion from use only by volunteer fire companies to authorize municipal departments to also be able to participate in this fund and be able to procure loans for fire apparatus and housing and equipment and EMS is because there has been a tremendous decline statewide in the number of all volunteer fire and EMS. And it's a problem that not just fire and EMS, but every volunteer organization is having. More are working further from home. Time is finite. And there's an argument even that firefighting over the years has become more dangerous. And there are fewer people who are willing to volunteer. So as a result, many departments have had to consolidate the way Wyomissing and Spring and Western Berks have done, and have a combination of volunteer and paid employees. Because there are so much fewer that are all volunteer, and so many that have similar needs but are part municipal fire company with paid as well as volunteer employees, that would have been the reason for attempting to expand or putting the ballot question on to expand the eligibility for the loan program for fire companies, ambulance, and rescue squads. It does not in any way increase indebtedness, by the way. It simply expands the pool of those eligible to participate. It has increased over the years. Just to give a brief history, indebtedness of up to $100 million was in 4 statewide referendum, 10 million in 1975, 15 million in 1981, 25 million in 1990, and then 50 million in 2002. So this is another change to the indebtedness. To the eligibility.
And Joan and I were talking before the program started. It used to be that cities and large towns had their own fire companies, which were municipally funded, and they could borrow money to buy an apparatus. But the volunteer organizations out in the more rural areas did not have that municipal backing or the ability to borrow money. And that's originally why it was set up the way it was set up. But obviously a lot has changed since then.
Right. The municipal fire companies and the volunteer fire companies, you still see the bake sales and the Fosnock sales and the chicken barbecues, but there's so much more needs. If you think
You're making me hungry here, Joan.
I'm not going to get home for supper until about 9 o'clock. So you see, you know, the fundraising is still there, but fundraising and even the firemen's relief funds are not enough to support the volunteer fire companies or the hybrid paid taxpayer supported volunteer fire companies. And the municipalities can't always entirely support the fire companies. Usually the municipality either guarantees a loan or gives part of the money to pay for fire apparatus, has its name on the title to the equipment or to the firehouse, or there are deed restrictions on land given for firehouse or EMS. But again, there are increased needs but not finite pool of money.
So this may make a difference for our townships and boroughs that have fire company or contribute to them, that they don't have to borrow the money because it can be gotten, the loaning would be by the state. So it might help us in our debt ratios and things locally.
It could.
I am thinking, I believe this one probably does not have a lot of controversy behind it. I
There
think,
was an
are you aware of
editorial.
anyone who's against this?
I haven't, and there was an editorial in Friday, April 30th in the Reading Eagle. And it listed 4 different firefighting associations all in favor of it. And I Googled and I could not find another firefighting organization association in Pennsylvania. So I'm guessing that it's all the agencies are in favor of it.
Yeah,
That doesn't mean that everybody likes it though.
I've seen only one argument against it, believing that it takes money away from the pool for all volunteer fire companies. That is the only argument that I have seen against it, and I have not seen numbers to support or disavow whether that's the case or not.
And these 4 organizations all disavowed that. They said that was a fallacy. That was not accurate. And I guess, you know, when you have a fire, you want whoever's nearest you to have that equipment. But well, let's go on then to our last one. And then that way Joan has still about 5 minutes she can be with us. So let's see here. Let's go to that 3rd amendment. Let me get my paperwork in the right order. So let's put that 3rd amendment on the screen. This is another constitutional amendment. It's a curious one. There we go. It's very simple. We add a new section to our Constitution providing that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged because of an individual's race or ethnicity. And I think we can take that down. This sounds like motherhood and apple pie, is it?
I would certainly hope so. It should not be controversial. I can tell you the reason why it is on the ballot and why it is being considered for a constitution, and that is that many other states also have this in their constitution, and many Fortune 500 type corporations will not do business in a state that does not have this guarantee as a matter of law.
So Randy, have you heard things about why it's in and why now?
Yeah, I heard that. I've heard that argument as well. And that makes sense. I think that's probably largely because of other states that maybe have had more of a racial history, but I guess we certainly have one here in Pennsylvania as well, of discrimination. The one thing that two possible other issues that I see, one that I would think of is that it's possible that people, when they were putting together the ballot questions, particularly the legislature, may have thought that this would be a good one to include at this time because this seems very non-controversial and you would think will get a very high yes vote. And they may have been thinking if they put those next to the more controversial amendments about the emergency powers, that that might help to drive more yes votes for those as well. Possibly, I don't know, that may have been a consideration, but maybe not. It may just be coincidental that those came up at the same time. And then another thing I would think could be possible, but I have not really heard this argument, is if we anchor this in the Constitution, would it be possible for people to use this in a legal argument to try to buttress claims of reverse discrimination? Where if someone wants to say, well, I was denied admission to Penn State because of affirmative action, that's against the state's constitution to be giving unusually favorable college access to minority groups as opposed to whites. So it could be potentially mobilized in that direction, perhaps. Although, as I say, I have not really heard that argument be raised against it. So I don't know. I don't know what you think about that. Or I see we
We'll
have a
get
possible
questions in just
question
a
here
minute,
too.
Renee.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll be there in just a minute, because the other thing I wanted to bring out here is that I'm wondering if in other states you had to include women in that group, but women already are in Pennsylvania's constitution as equal citizens, so it wouldn't be needed here. But I'm wondering in the other states that are adopting this, if they are indeed adding women where they haven't been there. Do we have any knowledge on that? That would be a good thing. That'll be my next research project.
Yes,
No,
League of
that
Women
is,
Voters, we should know that.
Yeah, we should. I mean, we know it's here. We know we're not, the national does not yet guarantee women that equal right. Are there any other comments either of you would like to make on this question? And if not, we'll go to our audience's questions. Okay, Renee, you're first up. Oh, wait, and Joan, go ahead.
I believe I was going to say that Renee had a question.
Yes.
You're muted, Renee.
Unmute yourself. If you want to ask a question, please unmute yourself.
Am I
You're unmuted. You're okay.
No,
No.
No, you're not.
You hit it, she hit it a second time. Now you're good.
Try again.
No,
No, you're muted. Okay, go.
Pennsylvania? Okay, let me back up. Does Pennsylvania have an ERA? And then my question is, how does that fit in here? Like, does that, the equality is just for men, or it applies to men and women, or? It's unclear to me if Pennsylvania has an ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, that includes women. Does this cover women as well as everyone? And if Pennsylvania does not have an ERA, does that apply only to men?
Pennsylvania does have an ERA, and I believe that it is that rights are not abridged on the basis of sex. So that should apply to both men and women. I mean, equal rights laws have been applied to both men and women nationally, and I believe by Pennsylvania civil rights laws as well.
Okay.
But if it was just phrased as gender equality with the ERA, then that wouldn't take care of the racial question, which is, I guess, why they felt they had to add the other one.
Right. And what's interesting here too is that it is race or ethnicity, because the federal civil rights laws, Title VII, it is along the lines of race and national origin, but the word ethnicity is not used. And there are sometimes questions with whether a matter is race, national origin, or religion. But when you start talking about discrimination on the basis of ethnicity, it often does not fit quite as neatly. And I have seen that argument raised in case law and in legal briefing.
Joan, I need to remind you that I can see in the clock above your head that it is 5 minutes of 7. And I thank you so much. You have added so much expertise to this session. Really appreciate it. But you need to go to your other meeting.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Anne and Judith.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really
Thanks,
appreciate
Joan.
it. I am a resident of Why I'm Missing, so I'm glad to help with the Why I'm Missing library series. I'll have to
We
stop
hope
by.
to see you there.
When you have in-person visitors, I will be coming back. I'll be
We
coming
do
in.
haven't, we are in person.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, we're open every day now.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, everybody, thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
Be leaving.
And we're open to more questions. If anybody has questions, you may unmute yourself and ask, or if you want to participate just in discussion, that's fine too.
Any questions? Anybody? If you have a question, please unmute yourself. Meanwhile, I'll keep you muted.
If no one has questions, I haven't heard any yet, but I'll give it another second. I have some resources for the rest of the ballot that you might want to note. I don't hear any other questions, so if you need to check your voter registration, you want to go to votespa.com. That will tell you if you're registered. It will tell you if you've requested an absentee ballot. It will tell you if the absentee ballot has been mailed to you. A very good resource to use. For information on the candidates on your ballot, I recommend vote411.org. That's vote411.org. This is a service sponsored by the National League where candidates answer questions, and it's fairly easy to compare their answers. For the statewide races, the statewide league contacts them, sends out the questions, they send it back in, and it goes directly into the system. So nothing has changed from what the candidates put down. And this year, for the first time ever, our local league has added information for the county-wide races and for Muhlenberg and Exeter townships and the city of Reading. We were starting out this year, so we started small with just a few select things. But by fall, we are hoping to have every school district and every township and borough covered. So you will know who all your candidates are. And we do realize and apologize in that most of the races take place in the primary. And sometimes there isn't much of a race left by the general and local stuff, but we had to do a small project to make sure everything worked properly. But that vote411.org will give you all the statewide candidates, all the judges running at the state and local and county level. And it will just provide a lot of resources, and it's one you can use again next year when we're electing Congress people and state representatives. All that information will be at your fingertips. Now, if you are voting by mail-in ballot and have not yet mailed it, there are 2 drop boxes open. One is at the Berks County Services Center in downtown Reading. And there are 3 reserved parking places outside on the little side street that's between the courthouse and the services center. So you can drive up, walk your ballot up to the drop box, walk back to your car and go. That should work smoothly. And there's a second drop box at the Berks Agricultural Center, and that has ample parking. And there's a circle in front of the building that you can use if you need the handicap. Both drop boxes are open all this week from 8 in the morning until 5 at night, and on Saturday from 8 until 1. But next Monday and Tuesday, they are open from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. So that really gives you every opportunity to get your ballot in. At this point, since it's 1 week away, you could still mail it, but if you really want to be certain it gets there, in my opinion, use the drop box.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
I think it's really important for people to know that, or to remember that you can only drop your ballot. You
Yes.
cannot collect ballots from your husband, your wife, your children, your neighbors, and drop them off. You can only drop off your ballot.
However, if there is someone handicapped in your household or someone who simply cannot get to the polls for some other reason, they can fill out an affidavit and give it to you with their ballot, and then you can drop it off.
Okay.
And that affidavit you can find on that website that's votespa.com. So if you have someone that you want to drop their ballot off, have them fill out the affidavit from the website, votespa.com. Bring that with their ballot, and then you can put their ballot in the drop box. So there is a way around that. You just don't want to get there and then realize you have to go back and get that affidavit. You want to do that ahead of time. And if you are voting in person, and I know a lot of people really like to do that, and it's good. I'm going to be doing that next fall because we're going to have new electronic poll books, and I want to see how they work. But I think this time we're still using the paper poll books. The election is next Tuesday, 1 week from today, and polls are open from 7 in the morning until 8 at night. So that pretty well covers all our information. Dr. Noonan, thank you so much. You added so much to this program, and we couldn't have done it without your expertise and the political science view on what all of it means. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Judith. I feel like I learned something too here, and I'm going to go to Votes 411 because I feel like there's some judge candidates and some things I don't know that much about. So that's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, and if it is a local judge running for Berks County, or any of the county-wide races that are contested, the League of Women Voters did interviews in cooperation with BCTV, and you would find those on the BCTV YouTube channel, and they're called Candidates Up Front. And I think we did close to 20 interviews of different candidates. And I found one of the most telling questions it's hard to ask judges questions because they can't answer anything they would have to rule on. So one of the questions I had was, who was your favorite Supreme Court justice, and past or present? They could go anywhere. And just hearing who they choose tells you what they value in legal representation on a bench. So that was a very interesting experience to talk to them all. So I would recommend the YouTube channel for BCTV and Candidates Up Front to watch in person what they said about themselves. We used to do the forums, but we found incumbents weren't willing to do that because they had so little to risk, or they were risking more than a newcomer. So we started doing the individual candidate interviews where they just talk about themselves. And that seems to work very well. You learn a lot when they're just conversing with you. So that was a good forum as well. So I want to thank everyone for being here and thank those of you who asked questions. And if you have any more questions, you can get them to Anne and she will get them to me, and the league will find the answer you need. So thank you all, and have a good evening.
I want to thank Dr. Noonan and Attorney London and Judith and the League of Women Voters for putting this program together. I will send an email out to all of you to let you know when it will be available on YouTube. So hopefully I will do that tomorrow or Friday by the latest.
Thanks, Anne.
It
Thanks,
might be
Judith.
Friday.
Yeah.
Thanks for
all.
setting this up, Anne. We appreciate it.
Thank you all. I hope we can do something again in the fall.
Sure, glad to.
Okay, great. It's nice to see you all. Hope maybe we'll see you at the library in the fall. Who knows?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, there would be. It would be great.
Yeah,
Okay,
when Joan
thank you
said
all.
it was almost over, I wanted to say from your mouth to God's ear. You know,
Right. Yeah,
we're so ready.
yeah. Okay, thank you all.
Good night.